Welcome back. Well, you've been watching those Judicial Service Commission hearings, those interviews for two positions on the Constitutional Court being held again after that threat of court action by the legal organisation JSC. So the candidates are basically being interviewed again. The day dominated so far, I suppose, by conversations around transformation on the bench, the fact that we still have very few women in the top courts in our country. Dr. Justice Mavedzenge is a constitutional lawyer and academic at the International Commission of Jurist. Dr. Mavedzenge, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. I have to say, to watch these interviews being held again is sort of a reminder of how strange this situation actually is.
Yes, good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to your viewers. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss this very important issue. At the International Commission of Jurists, we are very much interested in promoting the independence of judiciaries from across the world, and we do this by promoting the implementation of international law and regional standards. So it's very interesting to see what is happening in South Africa, which is a jurisdiction of interest to us as a Commission of Jurists.
I mean, the problem last time really was the way that the politicians behaved. Do you think they're going to change the way they behave this time? I mean, it's quite a complex thing. There are lots of democracies where politicians play a role in selecting judges.
Maybe the question is, what are the politicians looking for on the panel of selection of judges? But maybe let's get to that question a little bit later. I think, Stephen, the starting point is for your viewers to recall that there are about three key international and regional instruments which relate very well with the South African law on the appointment of judges. And when we look at those instruments and what they demand, then we will be able to then evaluate the conduct of the selection panel and then judge them as to whether they are doing well or not. For us at the ICJ, we are interested in Article 10 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 14.1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 26 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And these instruments, South Africa is a state party. South Africa has signed and ratified these instruments. What do they say about judicial appointments? They emphasize three things. One is that persons to be selected for judicial office should be persons of integrity and ability with appropriate training or qualifications in law. And any method of judicial selection shall safeguard against judicial appointments from improper motives. In other words, appointments should be made for the right motives or with the right motives, and the right people must occupy those positions. And lastly, the selection of judges should be free from unfair discrimination. Those are the three key important issues that I think we need to take into account. But of course, when you introduced this discussion, you highlighted the background to this issue, which is that sometime in July, CASAC raised two key issues which they were concerned about with respect to the way in which judges had been selected. One issue was about the interview process itself. There were concerns that the process was highly politicized to the extent that certain candidates were not treated fairly. In other words, candidates were not treated the same way or subjected to similar questions. Then there was a concern also about the quality of deliberations which were conducted after the interviews. And the concerns were that the deliberations were not conducted objectively and fairly. There were concerns that the Chief Justice produced a list of nominees who were rubber stamped by the JSC without any kind of substantive deliberations. But now for us at the ICJ, when we looked at this issue, we were concerned about probably the root causes for this. We think that South Africa is a highly politicized Judicial Service Commission. The presence of politicians on that panel sometimes leads to the politicization of the interview process itself. We think that the JSC needs to have a very tight criteria of interview questions to ensure that each candidate is asked questions that are similar in nature. We don't expect candidates to be asked the same question, but the questions should be similar in nature. And the criteria should touch on aspects that make up a good judicial officer. For example, knowledge of the law, their experience, their performance, temperament, We also think that the JSC needs to have a laid-out process for conducting deliberations after the interviews, and there's need for a criteria of questions against which each candidate is assessed during the deliberation. So we think these are the root causes for the kind of challenges that you saw happening in July, and we look forward to this process when we want to see if there is any change really.
So I mean, Doctor, I suppose that the real issue is, and I mean, let me just put it slightly simpler perhaps, is that we have many political issues that end up going to court. And so judges have to make decisions where politicians are in dispute. What happens then is that some of those politicians now sit on the Judicial Service Commission and get a chance to ask judges about those judgments. Now, that's the problem. Now, I made the point earlier that in many countries, in the United States, the Senate has to confirm, who sits on the Supreme Court of the United States. And the person is nominated by the president. I mean, that's an intensely political process. On the other hand, politicians represent voters, and voters should surely have a role in who gets to be a judge in some way.
For sure, I think I think you're right that voters should have a role to play in the selection of judges. In the South African context and in the context of many other nations where we work in, I think voters do so through what they make sure that the Constitution says. But if the ultimate objective is to have an independent judiciary, which is not politicized, then it becomes necessary to make sure that the process of appointing, the process of selecting and appointing those judges is done by a truly independent panel, a truly independent Judicial Service Commission. I don't mean to say that politicians should not question judges or should not have a role to play in terms of holding the judiciary accountable. But accountability and selection are two different processes that should be kept apart. I believe that, and indeed the ICJ, we believe that judges should be held accountable. There are mechanisms to do that. Parliament is one of them. But the process of selecting and appointing judges should be a process that is done by an independent panel. It is very difficult to think, it is very difficult for the JSC to be independent when it comprises of the number of politicians that we see who sit on that panel in South Africa.
Well, it's a very complex issue, Doctor. I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Justice Mavedzenge is a constitutional lawyer and academic at the International Commission of Jurist. I really appreciate the time. Well,